Hi, it's Llarold, and we're right about halfway between patch 11.0.5 and 11.0.7, and that means it's pretty much the exact middle of Season 1 of The War Within, and I think that this makes a perfect time for a recap on how I feel the season has gone and been going, and then maybe I can do a bit of wish casting for Season 2. My thinking here is that, if you're arriving to the expansion or the season late, or maybe you just played the first couple of months and then checked out, or if you just want to know my thoughts on The War Within so far, there will be something in this video for you. So there are really three things I want to talk about, and those would be the raid, Nerub-ar Palace, Mythic Plus, and this season's Mythic Plus dungeons, and the affix changes and just a lot of the systemic changes around Mythic Plus, and then finally delves. But first, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's YouTube law that I ask you to do that, and now I have, so we can get to it. So I'm coming right out the gate pretty hot here. I think this was my favorite raid of the past 5 or 6 expansions. In terms of tank mechanics, the raid isn't super complicated. It is punishing if you make mistakes though, and I like that. Now obviously I would love to see more complex tank mechanics in raids than just taunt swapping bosses back and forth, but that just isn't the world of Warcraft that we live in anymore, so that is kind of the curve I'm grading on here. And in terms of the boss fights, I think this raid is extremely good. I do not care for the Worm Boss Brood Twister. I think he's not great, but the first 4 bosses were all very, very decent. Sikron, Captain of the Sariki, is especially great, a real highlight and a pretty easy first half of the raid, but I think an appropriately easy first half of the raid. I thought they really nailed the tuning on the first 4 or 5 bosses. I think the last 3, they were overtuned, as they always are for kind of early progression, but then they hit the nerf button on those bosses pretty quickly. And once Queen Ansurek proved to be a wall for all the guilds outside of the world top 20 or whatever, they hit it with some very aggressive nerfs that actually came in way ahead of my expected schedule. I thought they would happen in mid to late December or even January, and they came in mid-November, way ahead of my expected schedule, like I said. I think pound for pound, the last 3 bosses are probably the best 3-boss final lineup they've ever done. I think Castle Nathria would be the other top contender in my mind. Sludgefist and Denathrius are definitely all-time fights. I think Nexus Princess and Queen Ansurek are pretty competitive, though. I think those are also all-time fights. Nexus Princess is just so fun and fast and frantic for 6 minutes of pain. I really enjoy the first and last phases of Queen Ansurek as well. Phase 2, not so much, but it's not awful. Now, Silken Court is definitely not on their level. There are better penultimate bosses. I enjoyed Ragalan and Echo of Neltharion more than Silken Court, but maybe not the bosses around those 2 bosses. And most of the time, I think the next to last boss in most raids is usually a real stinker, and I don't really feel that way about Silken Court at all. It's good. It's not amazing. I think that's why I would put this raid ahead of Castle Nathria. None of the bosses were a hot, stinky turd like Stone Legion generals. So if we're doing letter grading, and I mean, sure, why not? I think I would give this raid tier an A-, like a 92 out of 100, right? There's technically room for improvement, but really not very much, and it ended on a very positive note, which really helps leave a lasting impression in my mind that's very positive. And that's how I feel about this raid. I really enjoyed myself. This raid, especially the end of the raid, really helped me rekindle some of my love for the game. And that's actually a perfect segue, because the thing that made me question whether I like this game in the first place was also part of this season's content, and it was Mythic Plus dungeons. Specifically doing Mythic Plus dungeons, tanking them on a Brewmaster Monk, which, if you want to torture someone, that's a great way to do it. Trick them into playing a Brewmaster Monk in Mythic Plus, or really anything, but definitely Mythic Plus. So I want to break this section into 2 parts, the new affixes and the dungeons themselves, and so we'll start with the affixes. So in the run-up to this expansion, Blizzard's lead developers had several interviews in which they talked about the state of Mythic Plus, and they said they wanted to make this season of Mythic Plus be more or less a clean break from the past. They wanted players to have less of their mental space occupied by Mythic Plus affixes and be able to focus more on the dungeons themselves. They didn't want to just cut affixes. They still want that variety from week to week for players. They just wanted them to be like a touch of extra flavor on top of dungeons rather than something that takes over. So they made a group of totally passive affixes that made monsters more dangerous in various ways, more attack speed or whatever, but also made them take more of a certain type of damage, like fire or frost damage or arcane damage, that kind of thing. This meant that every week, a certain class of DPS would be gods and everyone else would be garbage, with mages basically always able to swap between one of the 3 specs and be a god every week, and then pretty much all the rest of the classes would be begging for a spot at the table 3 weeks out of every month. People absolutely hated it. They were right to. It was a really bad idea. So Blizzard quickly pivoted to the set of Xal'atath's Bargain Kiss Curse affixes that we have this season, all of which are massively more involved than the mechanics they replaced. Things like Bursting and Sanguine that just, they were annoying, but they were simple. Now don't get me wrong, I don't miss Sanguine, but in terms of playing the dungeon instead of the affix, this is a 0 on a scale of 100. It's just an abject failure of the stated design. Now in terms of working as a design, they're mid. They're not awful, but they're not good either. They spawn at inopportune times, such as boss burn phases or several seconds after combat has ended, and then they pulse you back into combat so you can't move ahead in the mists of Tir-Naseath maze. Xal'atath also says one and only one voice line each time she summons that week's affix, so it's really quite annoying. I have not enjoyed any of these affixes at any point in this season. Oblivion is the mechanic of those Xal'atath affixes that really stands out. It summons orbs that move toward enemies, and it just stands out as a badly made mechanic. The orbs are tied to enemy positions, but also their orientation. So if you move enemies around as a tank or spin enemies around as a tank, the orbs will fly all over the place erratically. It's extremely weird and irritating as the tank to have an orb over to your left that's moving right toward you, so you run left to grab it, but the monster you're taking moves toward you and kind of spins a bit, and so now the orb flies away in another direction and moves around you at 90-degree angles because it's getting stuck on seams in the floor. None of these Xal'atath bargain affixes are good, but this one is just like the most egregious. These aren't the only affixes that were added this season either. Challenger's Peril has seen a slight pity nerf in that it now grants an extra 90 seconds to the key's timer, but it still makes deaths count 15 seconds instead of 5 against the timer, so wiping in any high key is probably still a brick. It is possible to wipe once and still time if the group plays well otherwise, but the margin for error is very thin. I don't really watch MDI, but my understanding from MDI is that it basically has had the same impact on MDI as well. If one of the groups wipes or even just has like a handful of deaths in it, they pretty much are guaranteed to lose. That doesn't sound very competitive or fun. On top of that, you have to complete +10s in order to receive Myth Track loot from the weekly cache, and +10 dungeons now have both Fortified and Tyrannical active in every single week. So in terms of their stated goals of making dungeons more of the focus, with affixes being relegated to a less involved, simpler component of the experience of doing Mythic Plus, I think the design is a failure. It's like saying you want your New Year's resolution to be to go on a diet and like lose some weight, and then every day in January you eat a gallon of ice cream. It's just the exact opposite of what they said they wanted to do. Now there is one big positive, and that's for high-level key pushers. The high-level key situation is actually very good. At key level 12 and beyond, Xal'atath turns off those weekly Kiss Curse affixes, and the dungeons just get an extra 10% life and damage multiplier instead. This means that every week is push week for high-level players. They effectively got rid of push week, and this is something that high-level players have been asking to have for years, and I'm actually really happy for them that Blizzard has given them exactly what they want. I would actually enjoy keys more in the 11 and below level if that were the design they had gone with for lower keys as well. So affix-wise, I would actually give this season an F on a letter grade. I think Blizzard just completely missed the mark. I might be crazy, but I would actually go back to the old system over the current one. Just having Tyrannical and Fortified active every single week, both of them, is so much worse than dealing with the likes of Bolstering and Sanguine. Now, as for the 8 Mythic Plus dungeons that are in this season, I think it's a pretty clean 50-50 split between the dungeons that are pretty good and the dungeons that are not good at all. Dawnbreaker is a dungeon that's really fast and I think only slightly painful. I do realize it's quite a bit of work for the healer, but as a tank, I really think it's pretty fun. I do not like the first or last bosses. I just don't really think they're particularly interesting from a tank perspective, but I do think the trash is. I like how quick the dungeon is. I think the second boss is actually really, really good as a tank. Overall, it's a pretty good dungeon. It is, like I said, hard on healers, and I think the opening sequence with flying between the ships is extremely janky. But overall, the dungeon is pretty good. Arakaira is my favorite dungeon of this season. The final boss is really complex for some players, but I really like it. It definitely feels like an aborted raid boss that was then like scaled down to be a dungeon boss instead. There's always something going on, always something to dodge or deal with. It's extremely chaotic and active, but I really love it. I think the rest of the dungeon is pretty decent, not quite at the level of that final boss, but if the entire dungeon were at that level, it would just be too much intensity for most players. Necrotic Wake was a dungeon that started out very overtuned at the beginning of the season and really just like evil, but with some of the nerfs that have come to it, and then removing the ability to overlap a bunch of spears onto a single boss, but then also tuning around that nerf, I think it's legitimately a pretty good dungeon now. The only part I don't really like still as a tank is just that the final boss hits like a Mack truck, but his attacks don't count as auto attacks, so you can't dodge them on a muck. Haha. And then finally, Mists of Tyr-Naseath is pretty good. It's a fan favorite dungeon. I've actually found that I like it less and less the more I run it, if I'm being honest. I'm very bored by the second and third boss in that place. I really don't think that they're great. They're fine, but the main reason that I still enjoy Mists is just simply that most people run it a lot, so they know it very well. And because they know it well, they tend to play better in there, which then makes it easier. I actually don't feel that it is an easier dungeon in an absolute sense, but when people make fewer mistakes, things are easier, so it is relatively easy. And now for the 4 dungeons I think are bad: City of Threads, Stone Vault, Siege of Borealis, and Grim Batol. City of Threads' second and third bosses are just awful. The spy tracking section in the dungeon is awful. It's just a bad dungeon. Stone Vault is, I think, fine for the most part, but that third boss is just really overtuned. It has a leap away mechanic where it then needs to be interrupted immediately that I just find very irritating unless you're on a prot paladin or you have a shaman in your group who you can rely on. So just really, the whole dungeon is overtuned, but the third boss I think is definitely the worst. Having a split council boss that you have to kill at the same time in a Mythic Plus dungeon is, very punishing. Siege of Borealis is probably the worst Mythic Plus dungeon of all time, at least until next season. I mean, I know King's Rest also existed, so yeah, okay, fine. Second worst of all time. And Grim Butthole is Grim Butthole. The bosses were basically just not updated for the War Within. They're extremely boring, they do almost nothing, and you get to kite Throngus. It's a really stupid fight, and I just cannot believe that they left Throngus like he is for an expansion that was released in the year 2024. So in terms of rating the dungeons overall, I think I would give them a C. I don't think this is the worst season ever. I remember the first couple seasons of Shadowlands doing Spires of Ascension and Plaguefall was awful. Theater of Pain 2, for that matter. Can't wait for season 2. There are some pretty good dungeons this season, but with that being said, they really phoned it in on Grim Batol. The bosses are just so bad. Siege of Borealis had absolutely no business ever coming back, and City of Threads is really long and boring. So I really don't think this is a great dungeon season. I would say that giving them a C is pretty generous. Now, there are some other issues that have plagued Mythic Plus outside of the affixes in the dungeon pool that I'll just kind of briefly mention. I think the 2 biggest ones are the state of gear progression being radically slower than it has been in previous seasons, and the change to non-interrupt stops like stuns or disorients, no longer causing an enemy's spells to go on cooldown. These were every bit as problematic as the other issues I've mentioned previously, and they're even more pervasive. Like, if you hate Grim Butthole, you can just not run it. If you hate that Protection Paladin has 500% more interrupts than any other class in the game, and the leg sweep totally sucks compared to Avenger Shield, well, that's just too bad. As for gearing, when gearing is faster, I play the game more and work on more characters. I really do enjoy playing alts. It is what makes me most happy when I'm playing WoW. And when gearing is slower, I play my main characters, my couple, 2, 3, 4 tanks that I'm going to keep geared, and then I find other things to do with my time instead of bothering with alts. And unfortunately, the current state of the gearing system has led to me doing exactly that. So in terms of giving letter grades, I think Mythic Plus this season has really been one of the worst seasons in my memory. I do appreciate that Blizzard tried to cook something different, but what came out was a hot pocket that's burned on the outside and still frozen in the middle. The affixes are not good. The dungeons are okay, and they have been way too slow and conservative with changes, 2 classes and 2 dungeons to get things into a really enjoyable state. Now, with all of that being said, I've been playing Paladin and GK in Mythic Plus a lot over the last month or 2, and they are a real breath of fresh air compared to Monk. It's actually pretty fun to run Mythic Plus on a Paladin, also on a Warrior. I should add that in there. I don't know why that's not in my notes, but Paladin, Warrior, and DK have all been extremely fun compared to Monk, even with all the complaints I still absolutely do have about Mythic Plus this season, whereas walking to my PC to log in and play Monk in dungeons just feels like a death march. So I would give this season a C-. I think it is objectively my least favorite season ever, if I consider the entire package, the gearing, the affixes, the dungeons, all of that. With the current state of Paladin, DK, and Warrior as tank classes all really helped elevate it out of the flames of hell and into a state that's just kind of okay. It's not garbage, it's just frozen pizza, it's okay. Now I want to talk about delves. I previously made a video about delves while Blizzard was still in the process of rebalancing / re-breaking them, and since then they have been made slightly easier, but they still have the same issue now that they had then. Blizzard doesn't really seem like they know what they want delves to be. What they reward is relatively limited quantities of normal gear, roughly 4 pieces a week, and up to heroic gear out of the weekly cache. That's a good bit of gear for a casual player, but it's really not anything enticing for like a high-level player. But if that's the case, why do the monsters hit harder than Mythic raid bosses? The difficulty level is just not at all in line with the reward structure. A max level reward delve gives a whopping 2 heroic crests and 25 valor stones. The key system forces players to go around doing trivially easy content in order to get rewards from delves. So my read on the situation is that delves are supposed to be super duper easy content, you know, baby dungeons. If the tuning was in line with that, I think it would make sense, but it's just way, way off. They are so hard compared to the reward that they give. If delves at the highest levels, we're talking 10s and 11s, offered a way to solo farm mythic crests or myth track gear in your weekly cache, then I think the current state of tuning would totally make sense. I have cleared all the delves on plus 11s on my monk and on my DK. I worked harder doing that than I did killing any of the mythic bosses in the entire raid or in any Mythic Plus dungeon this season. And as someone who enjoys a challenge, I did actually have a lot of fun. I think delves are fun content, and that is good. But what was my reward? I get to brag about it in this video, and that appears to be it. In terms of like bad delve design, I know there's a lot of complaints, a lot of Reddit posts spilled about the underwater delves, but I actually have more of an issue with the delves that make you hold a candle or an air purifier. Limiting player movement is a really lame mechanic. I just really do not like it. You can drop the candle and just move around within that confined circle. That is what you do. It's just not a fun challenge to me at all. It's something I would like to see completely reconsidered. I think sprinting between air bubbles and between pulls is something I actually do kind of find enjoyable, at least by comparison. You know, underwater levels in video games are almost always bad. Sewer levels are usually bad, so maybe it's a matter of expectations. I expect the underwater levels to suck, and then they're not really bad, so it's actually kind of a pleasant surprise, whereas I think caves should be fun, and I do not find those caves with the air purifier or the candle to be fun at all. So that's my review of delves. I do not know what Blizzard wants them to be. I do not feel that they do either. I would give the grade an incomplete. If the system remains as it is in terms of reward structure and tuning in further seasons, I would consider it a failure. Something has to give, one direction or another. So let's wrap things up. I really like this tier's raid. It is an all-timer for me. It makes me very hopeful for the next tier as well. As for this Mythic Plus season, it's an all-timer, just in the opposite direction. And delves, they're kind of all over the place. I really do think they're fun, but they're overtuned and they're under-rewarding. So overall, I am playing the game and I am having fun, at least when I'm playing like Pally, DK, and Warrior. And I think if I could change anything for the upcoming season, I think actually hitting that intended design goal of affixes that add flavor without complication or, God, without spamming a single voice line all week long sounds really good. Challenger's Peril needs to be removed immediately, and the speed of gear progression definitely needs to be accelerated. With all that being said, I think if they manage to do that, I am hopeful that the next season, even with the dungeon pool being Garbanzo, I think it could be pretty good. As for delves, I have no idea what they're going to do. I would like for them to keep the difficulty roughly the same and just up the rewards and give more potential to get myth track crests and myth track gear as a solo player, just spam running delves. I think that with the challenge level that delves provide, it is substantially harder to do at plus 11 delve than it is to do a plus 10 dungeon. I think that the reward structure should be relatively comparable, and if they were to pull that off, I think that would make me pretty happy. All right, I think that pretty much covers it. Thanks for watching. Bye.